They say family is where you're always welcome back. But what happens when that very family, the only daughter you raised and loved your whole life, stabs you in the back the night you bury your beloved wife? Nathan Mercer lost everything in 7 days: home, money, dignity, and most painfully, faith in his family. But they were wrong to think he was dead. If you're watching this video, hit like now, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part, and comment your city name below. I want to know how far this story has traveled in the world. The morning we buried Margaret, it rained so hard the cemetery workers had trouble keeping their footing in the mud. I remember standing there under a black umbrella that kept turning inside out in the wind, watching the casket being lowered, and thinking that 41 years wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. Margaret had been sick for 2 years. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't negotiate and doesn't give you time to prepare, no matter how much the doctors try to prepare you. We'd spent the last 8 months driving back and forth to the oncology center 3 hours away, staying in a budget motel when she was too weak to make the return trip, watching game shows together at 2 in the morning because neither of us could sleep. I had held her hand through every infusion. I had learned to cook the bland foods she could keep down. I had read to her from the old Louis L'Amour westerns she loved, doing the voices for all the characters because it made her laugh even when laughing hurt. She died on a Tuesday, quietly, the way she had lived. Our daughter Diane arrived the evening before the funeral. She flew in from Phoenix with her husband, Carson Wells, and I won't pretend I wasn't relieved to see her. I needed family around me. I was 71 years old, and I had just lost the only person who had known me completely. And I was standing in our big house with 30 years of her belongings still everywhere. Her reading glasses on the side table, her cardigan folded over the arm of the sofa, and I didn't know what to do with myself. "Dad." Diane hugged me at the door, and I held on longer than I should have. She smelled like expensive perfume, something sharp and floral that Margaret never would have worn. "You look exhausted." "I'm fine," I told her. The automatic answer, the one men of my generation give when they are not even remotely fine. Carson shook my hand. Firm grip, direct eye contact, the kind of handshake a man practices. He was 44, a real estate developer who had built his reputation in commercial properties and mixed-use developments. He dressed like money even when he was supposedly being casual. That evening he was wearing slacks and a collared shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and I remember thinking he looked like a man who had somewhere more important to be. "We're here for you, Nathan," he said. He always called me Nathan, never Dad, which I had told myself was just a generational thing and not a signal. We had dinner together, takeout from a restaurant Diane ordered from her phone, and we talked about the service and what Margaret had wanted and how many of her friends from the garden club were going to come. We didn't talk about the future. Not that night. That night was still sacred. The funeral was the next day. 63 people came, which felt like both a lot and not nearly enough. Margaret's sister drove in from Albuquerque. 3 of her former colleagues from the school district where she'd worked as a bookkeeper for 22 years made the trip. The pastor, someone Diane had arranged because she said the minister Margaret had known for years was out of town, gave a service that was decent but impersonal, like a eulogy assembled from a template. I got through it. I don't know how. You just do. What I wasn't prepared for was what happened the following morning. I came downstairs at 7, expecting to find Diane making coffee, or maybe sitting quietly with her grief the way I was sitting with mine. Instead, I found her and Carson at the dining room table with a manila folder open between them and a legal pad covered in Carson's handwriting. "Morning, Dad," Diane said. She smiled at me, but it was a careful smile, the kind that's managing something. "What's all this?" I asked. "Come sit down," Carson said. "We need to talk through some things while we're all here together." I poured myself a coffee and sat down. I wasn't alarmed yet. I was 60 hours out from burying my wife, and I was running on grief and 3 hours of sleep and the kind of hollow exhaustion that lives behind your eyes. I wasn't thinking clearly. I wasn't thinking defensively. I was just a man sitting down at his own kitchen table with his daughter and son-in-law, thinking we were about to have a hard but necessary conversation about what came next. I had no idea what came next actually meant. Carson opened the folder. Inside were several documents, neatly printed and organized. "Your wife had a will," he said, which I already knew because I had been present when she signed it. "But she updated it last year. Did you know that?" I blinked. She updated it? "About 14 months ago. Her attorney filed the paperwork. We've already been in contact with his office." I felt something cold move through my chest. She never mentioned that to me. "It can be hard to bring up," Diane said. Her voice was gentle in a practiced way. "Especially when she was sick. She probably didn't want to upset you." I looked at her. My daughter. The little girl I had coached through her first bicycle ride in our driveway, who I had driven to every single one of her dance recitals for 7 years, whose college tuition I had paid without complaint, even when money was tight, who had cried on my shoulder the night her first serious boyfriend broke her heart. "What does the updated will say?" I asked. Carson slid one of the documents across the table. "The house passes to Diane. The primary accounts are split, with the larger portion going into a trust that Diane administers. You retain a property out in Kern County, a farm Margaret inherited from her uncle years ago." I stared at the document without reading it. My brain had stopped processing the words correctly. "The house passes to Diane," I repeated. "It was Margaret's wish," Diane said. "Dad, this house is too big for one person. You've said that yourself. And with your health, my health is fine." "Dad." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her nails were perfectly manicured. "We're worried about you. That's all this is. We want to make sure you're taken care of." Taken care of. I turned that phrase over in my mind while Carson kept talking, explaining the logistics, the timelines, the accounts. I had built a career as a construction engineer. I had designed load-bearing structures for 30 years. I understood, at a fundamental level, how things held together and how they fell apart. And sitting at that table, I felt the first tremor of something I couldn't name yet, a hairline fracture in the foundation of everything I thought I knew about my family. The farm in Kern County. I knew the place, barely. Margaret had mentioned it a handful of times over the years. Her Uncle Harold had left it to her when she was in her 30s, some piece of desert land about 200 miles away that she'd never done anything with. The last time it came up in conversation, she described it as that crumbling old place, and we'd both laughed about what on earth we'd ever do with a broken-down farm in the middle of nowhere. And now, apparently, that was my inheritance. They didn't give me long to absorb it. The morning moved fast, faster than I understood at the time. Diane kept talking, Carson kept presenting documents, and there was a rhythm to it that I couldn't see clearly until much later. It was choreographed. Every question I asked had an answer waiting for it. Every hesitation I showed was smoothed over by one of them before it could develop into actual resistance. By noon, they had walked me through 3 separate documents that I signed. I am not a stupid man. I want to make that clear. I have a civil engineering degree and 40 years of professional experience, and I have navigated contracts and liability agreements and municipal permits for the better part of my adult life. But I was 71 years old, and I was grieving, and I trusted my daughter, and those 3 things combined into something that overrode every alarm that should have been going off in my head. The first document was described to me as a transition agreement for the house, an acknowledgement that the property transfer was being handled according to the will. The second was described as a management authorization that would allow Diane to handle the primary accounts during the estate settlement period. The third one, I didn't understand the third one at all, and when I said so, Carson smiled and said it was just standard probate paperwork and not to worry about it. Diane squeezed my hand and said, "Dad, we're on your side. We just want to get through this efficiently so we can all grieve properly." I signed. I have replayed that moment 10,000 times since. The pen in my hand, the paper on the table, my daughter sitting across from me with her careful smile and her expensive perfume and her eyes that did not look like the eyes of someone who was grieving at all. I signed. By the end of the week, I understood what I had done. The management authorization was not standard probate paperwork. It was a broad power of attorney document that gave Diane control over my primary financial accounts. Within 4 days, she had initiated 3 wire transfers totaling $260,000. the bulk of the liquid savings Margaret and I had accumulated over decades of careful, unglamorous work. I found out when I tried to use my debit card at the grocery store, and it was declined. I drove to the bank. The teller, a young woman who looked genuinely uncomfortable, told me the account balance was $412. She asked if I wanted to speak with a manager. I sat in the bank parking lot for 40 minutes before I could drive. I called Diane's cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Same result. I called Carson's number and he picked up on the 3rd ring. "Nathan," he said, his voice pleasant and measured. "What's going on?" "You know what's going on," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "The accounts." "Oh, right. Diane moved those funds into the estate trust. It's all accounted for, part of the process." "Carson, that was our savings." "It's part of the estate, Nathan. It'll all get sorted out in probate. These things take a little time." A pause. "Are you doing okay? You sound stressed." "Stressed." I almost laughed. "I need to talk to Diane." "She's at a meeting right now. I'll have her call you later." She didn't call. Not that night, not the next morning. When I drove to the house, my house, or what had been my house, the keypad code had been changed. I stood on the front porch for a full minute before I accepted what was happening. I rang the doorbell. Nobody answered, but I saw the curtain in the front window move. They were home. They just weren't opening the door. I want you to understand something about that moment. It wasn't like the movies where a person experiences a dramatic revelation and their face changes and the music swells. It was much smaller than that. It was standing on a front porch I had built the steps for with my own hands, in a neighborhood I had chosen because the elementary school district was good, outside a house where my daughter had grown up and my wife had died, and realizing with a slow and terrible certainty that the 2 people on the other side of that door did not care if I lived or died. That was the real grief. The other thing, losing Margaret, that was loss. It was devastating and enormous, and it would take years. But standing on that porch, that was something different. That was betrayal. And betrayal, I was learning, has a different weight than grief. Grief bends you. Betrayal breaks something specific. I drove to the one motel in town that charged by the week. It was a tired beige building off the highway with a vending machine that didn't work and a parking lot that smelled like motor oil. I paid cash for 2 weeks, which took nearly everything left in my wallet. That night, sitting on the edge of a bed with a polyester comforter and a television bolted to the wall, I went through everything. The paperwork they'd had me sign. The account notices I'd been forwarding to Diane because she'd asked me to, said it would make the process easier. The language in the will update, which I now read with the specific and miserable focus of a man who has nothing left to do but understand how badly he's been played. The farm in Kern County. I pulled it up on the motel's slow Wi-Fi. Satellite images, county records, anything I could find. Dusty acreage. An old farmhouse with a collapsed roof section. A barn that looked held together primarily by habit. A dirt road running a 1/4 mile from the county highway. 240 acres of what appeared to be absolutely nothing. Margaret, I thought, why? I had loved that woman for 41 years, and I thought I knew her completely. Her sense of humor, her stubbornness, her kindness, the exact way she took her coffee, the books she read twice, the songs she hummed without realizing. I thought there was nothing she had kept from me, but she had updated her will without telling me. She had left me a broken farm in the desert. And she had apparently left the house and most of the accounts to the daughter who had emptied those accounts within 72 hours of getting her hands on the authorization. That night, for the first and only time since the cemetery, I let myself cry. Not for the money, not for the house, not even for the humiliation of having my debit card declined at $40 worth of groceries. I cried because I had trusted the wrong people, and because the one person who would have known what to say was gone. But sometime after midnight, when the crying had run dry and I was just lying there staring at a water stain on the ceiling, something shifted. Not anger, exactly. Anger is hot and loud, and it makes you stupid. This was quieter than that. It was the kind of cold, methodical focus I used to feel when I was staring at a set of blueprints and realizing the whole structure had been designed around a fundamental error, and understanding that finding the error was not the end of the problem, It was the beginning of the solution. Margaret had left me that farm for a reason. She was the smartest person I had ever known, and she had spent 2 years knowing she was going to die. And she had been a bookkeeper for 2 decades before that, a woman who understood numbers and documentation and the way paper trails either protect you or bury you. She had seen something in Diane that I had refused to see, or maybe she'd seen something in Carson. Either way, she had prepared for it. She hadn't abandoned me. She had left me a map. I just didn't know yet what it led to. I sat up in that motel bed at 1 a.m. in the worst week of my life with $400 and a broken farm to my name, and I made a decision that surprised even me. I was going to drive out to Kern County. I was going to walk that land. I was going to find out what my wife had actually left me, and I was going to do it before Diane and Carson figured out there was anything worth taking. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there in the dark and listened to a truck pass on the highway and thought about Margaret. Not the hospital version, not the casket version, but the alive version, the version that sat across from me at breakfast for 40 years and read the newspaper with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and argued with me about whether the coffee was too strong. She had been trying to tell me something. She just hadn't been able to say it while she was still alive. I was going to listen. I left the motel at 4:30 in the morning, not because I had slept and woken up refreshed. I hadn't slept at all. I left because lying in that room any longer felt like waiting to drown, and whatever else I was not a man who waited. I threw my 2 bags into the back of my truck, a 10-year-old F-150 that Diane had once suggested I trade in for something more appropriate for a man your age, by which she meant something smaller, slower, easier to dismiss. And I pulled out of that parking lot before the sun had even considered rising. The drive to Kern County takes just under 3 hours from where we lived. I did it in the dark, mostly on 2-lane roads once I got off the interstate, with the high beams cutting through scrub brush and the occasional jackrabbit freezing in the light before bolting. I had a gas station coffee in the cup holder that went cold before I was 40 miles out. I didn't stop to replace it. I wasn't drinking it for the warmth. I was drinking it to have something to do with my hands. I thought about Margaret the whole way. Not the sick version of her, not the final weeks. I kept going further back to the Margaret who had sat across from me at our kitchen table 20 years ago with a legal pad and a pencil, helping me figure out how to restructure a construction loan after a project went sideways, and we nearly lost everything. She had a gift for that kind of thinking, calm, sequential, unsentimental about numbers, even when the numbers were terrifying. She didn't panic. She didn't catastrophize. She just looked at the problem and said, okay, let's figure out what we actually have. She had known Diane since Diane was born. She had loved her the way mothers love daughters, completely and with full awareness of every flaw. And somewhere in the last few years of her life, while she was sick and I was focused on taking care of her, she had made a series of decisions about that farm and that will and those documents that she had never once brought up in conversation. That wasn't an accident. Margaret didn't do things by accident. The sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern horizon when the GPS told me to turn off the county highway onto a dirt road. I felt the truck's suspension absorb the change in surface and slowed down. The road was rutted and uneven, and on either side of it the desert stretched out flat and pale in the early light, creosote bushes, the occasional saguaro, dust that hadn't been disturbed in a long time. The property appeared after about a quarter mile. My first honest reaction was that it looked worse than the satellite images had suggested, which was saying something. The farmhouse was a 1-story structure that had probably been modest even in its prime, and its prime was clearly at least 50 years ago. The roof had partially collapsed on the eastern side. The front porch had lost 2 of its support posts and sagged at an angle that made it look exhausted. The windows that weren't boarded up were filmed with desert grime. The barn, set back about 60 feet from the house, was larger than I expected and in slightly better shape. Slightly being the operative word. The wood siding had gone gray and was pulling away from the frame in several places. The big rolling door at the front was padlocked with a chain that looked newer than anything else on the property. I sat in the truck for a moment. "Okay, Margaret," I said out loud, to nobody. "What am I looking at?" I got out and walked the property first, the way I always approached a new site. Perimeter first, details after. The acreage was flat and dry and cracked. Nothing had been cultivated here in decades. There were the remnants of what might have been an irrigation system, pipes half buried in the dirt, but they hadn't carried water in longer than I could estimate just from looking. The land had been resting, or more accurately, the land had been waiting. I circled the barn twice before I tried the padlock. It was a heavy-duty unit, and the key I'd found in the envelope with the property documents, the one Diane and Carson had apparently not noticed or not bothered with, fit it cleanly. The lock opened with a solid chunk that echoed in the morning quiet. I rolled the door back on its track. The barn was empty, or it appeared to be. Just a dirt floor, wooden support beams casting long shadows in the early light filtering through the gaps in the siding, and the smell of old wood and dust, and something else I couldn't identify. I walked the length of it slowly. I was almost at the far wall when I noticed the floor. A construction engineer spends 30 years looking at surfaces: concrete, compacted soil, poured foundations. You develop an eye for when something doesn't match its surroundings. The dirt floor of that barn was consistent throughout, except for a section near the back wall, approximately 12 feet by 14 feet, where the surface was fractionally smoother and the color was a shade lighter, indicating it hadn't had the same years of weathering as the rest. It was subtle enough that someone not looking for it would never see it. But I was looking. I crouched down and pressed my hand flat against the surface. Concrete, sealed and painted to look like compacted dirt. I found the seam after another 10 minutes of careful inspection, a nearly invisible line running around the perimeter of the concrete section, with two flush-mounted steel handles that I only located because I ran my fingers along the edge until I found them. I took hold of both handles, braced my knees, and pulled. The hatch came up on a counterbalanced hinge, smooth and heavy, and clearly engineered by someone who knew what they were doing. Below it, a set of wide concrete steps descended into a lit space, battery-powered LED strips along the ceiling, still functioning, and below that light, the space opened up. I stood at the top of those stairs for a long moment. Then I went down. The vault, and that's the only word for it, was roughly 40 feet by 60 feet, with a ceiling height of about 10 feet. The concrete walls were poured smooth and sealed. Climate-controlled, I realized almost immediately. The air down there was cooler and drier than above, and I could hear the quiet hum of what turned out to be a discrete ventilation and temperature management system built into the far wall. Someone had spent serious money on this space. Not recently. The construction had the quality and style of work done at least 20 years ago, but the systems had been maintained and updated more recently, and what was in it stopped me cold. Along the left wall, parked with the precision of a showroom, were 6 automobiles. Not regular automobiles. A 1966 Shelby Cobra, painted an electric blue that looked wet even under artificial light. A 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air in two-tone cream and turquoise, perfect down to the chrome accents. A 1969 Dodge Charger in the original Hemi orange. A 1961 Ferrari. 250 GT that I stood in front of for 30 seconds without breathing. A 1970 Plymouth Cuda convertible, and at the far end, partially covered with a cloth that had been folded back, a 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing that I recognized from the automotive reference books I'd read in my 20s. I knew enough about collector cars to know I was looking at several $1,000,000. The Ferrari alone, if it was genuine and documented, and standing in that vault I had no reason to believe it was anything other than both, was worth more than the house Diane had taken from me. I pressed my back against the wall and just breathed for a minute. Along the right side of the vault were 2 large steel filing cabinets, a working desk with a laptop computer in a protective case, and a series of cardboard archive boxes stacked neatly on industrial shelving. Against the back wall was a smaller locked cabinet, and taped to its front was a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Margaret's handwriting. Her handwriting. On an envelope in a vault 60 feet underground. My hands were not entirely steady when I pulled it free. Inside was a letter. 4 pages, front and back, in her careful script. She had always written by hand for anything important, said it forced her to think more clearly than typing did. The date at the top was 14 months ago, which meant she had written it during her second round of treatment, during the months when we had both been pretending to be more hopeful than we were. I sat down on the concrete floor. There were no chairs, and I read it. I'm not going to reproduce every word here, because some of what Margaret wrote was between a wife and a husband and belongs to nobody else. But I will tell you what she told me, because without it, none of what came afterward would make any sense. She had known about Diane and Carson for 3 years. Not suspected. Known. She had been keeping her own records. It had started, she wrote, when Carson approached her privately 2 years before her diagnosis with a proposal. He wanted her and me to invest a substantial sum in one of his development projects, a commercial complex outside Scottsdale. The returns he projected were aggressive, and the documentation he provided was glossy but thin. Margaret, who had spent 22 years as a bookkeeper and understood financial documents the way I understood load-bearing structures, had taken the materials to a friend of hers, a woman who had worked in financial forensics before retiring, and asked her to look them over. What came back was alarming. The project Carson was pitching was legitimate on its surface, but buried in the subsidiary structures was a pattern of fund routing that her friend described as consistent with the early stages of a fraudulent investment scheme. Not proven, not certain, but consistent enough that Margaret had declined the investment without telling me the real reason, and had begun, quietly, to watch. What she found over the following 2 years, documented in those filing cabinets, organized with the methodical precision of a woman who had never wasted a paper trail in her life, was a pattern. Carson had run at least 3 similar investment structures over the past 6 years. 2 had collapsed, with outside investors losing significant money, while Carson had exited early through layered corporate structures that were difficult but not impossible to trace. Diane knew. Margaret was careful to say she couldn't prove Diane had known at the beginning, but by the time she wrote that letter, she was certain her daughter understood exactly what her husband was doing and had chosen to remain his partner in it. She had also, the letter said, recognized that when she died, Diane and Carson would come for me. I was trusting, I was grieving, I would not see it coming. I couldn't tell you while I was alive, she wrote. I tried twice and couldn't do it. You love her the way fathers love daughters, completely and without condition, and I could not be the person who broke that. I kept thinking, maybe I was wrong. Maybe Carson would stop. Maybe Diane would see what she was becoming. I waited too long, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for what you've had to go through to get to this letter. I know you. I know it was bad. I need you to understand that everything I did after that conversation with my friend, I did to protect you, not to punish Diane, not to be clever, only to make sure that when they came, and they would come, you would not be left with nothing. She had moved the cars here over a period of 18 months, using a transport service Carson had no connection to, paying in cash drawn from accounts she had opened separately. The collection had been assembled over our entire marriage, pieces she had quietly acquired as investments, always in her name, always documented, always kept in storage facilities she changed periodically. I had known she had a few pieces she'd bought over the years. I had not known the scale of it. That was the thing about Margaret. She was never dishonest with me. But she understood the difference between information shared freely and information shared when asked. I had never asked about the collection in detail, and so she had never detailed it. The forensic files in those cabinets documented everything she had gathered on Carson's financial schemes. Her contact, a woman named Ruth, who I later learned was a former senior investigator with the SEC before she retired, had prepared several of the analyses. The documentation was not just credible, it was devastating, and the farm itself. Margaret had done something I would not have thought to do in 100 years. She had commissioned a hydrological survey of this land 8 years ago, quietly, through an environmental consulting firm. The results, filed in the second cabinet, 2 inches thick, showed that beneath this property lay a substantial underground aquifer, fed by a geological formation that ran deep and consistently. The farm's surface was desert. What lay below it was water. Enough water, the survey projected, to supply a major development project for decades. And here was the part that hit me like a physical blow. There was a development project, Carson's latest and most ambitious undertaking, the one he was currently raising capital for, the futuristic city project he'd been marketing to investors, had been announced 18 months ago. It was projected at several $billion and centered on a site in Kern County. This site, or more precisely, the site adjacent to and partly overlapping with this site, Because the water table the developers needed ran directly under this land. Without water rights to this property, the project could not move forward. The county's environmental permitting structure made that clear in the documents Margaret had gathered. And this property, per the will, belonged to me, fully, cleanly, without the ambiguity that surrounded the house and the accounts. Carson hadn't ignored the farm because it was worthless. He'd made sure I got the farm because he planned to come back for it. He assumed I would have no idea what it was worth. He assumed a broken-down old man handed a crumbling piece of desert, stripped of his savings and his home, would be in no position to resist when they returned with an offer or a threat. I sat on that concrete floor for a long time after I finished the letter. The cars, the files, the water, the letter. Margaret hadn't left me a broken farm. She had left me a fortress. I read the letter again from the beginning, more slowly. There was a postscript at the end of the last page, added in handwriting that was shakier than the rest, the way her writing had gotten in the final weeks. It said, "The laptop has everything backed up and encrypted. The password is the name of the dog we had the year Diane was born, first letter capital, followed by the year we got married. You remember, I know you remember. I love you, Nathan. Don't let them win." The dog's name was Biscuit. We got married in 1983. I opened the laptop. It asked for a password. I typed Biscuit1983. The screen unlocked, and there, organized in clearly labeled folders, was everything Margaret had built. Financial records, survey documents, vehicle titles and authentication certificates, her friend Ruth's forensic analyses, correspondence, a folder labeled simply Legal that contained the name and contact information of an attorney in Bakersfield, a woman Margaret had apparently consulted the previous year, who was already familiar with the situation, who was, the accompanying note said, trustworthy, aggressive when she needs to be, and already paid a retainer. Margaret had thought of everything. I closed the laptop and set it carefully on the desk. I walked back to the stairs and climbed up out of the vault and stood in the barn with the morning light coming in through the gaps in the siding, and I looked at the desert land through the open door. 240 acres of what had appeared to be absolutely nothing. My hands were steadier now than they'd been in days. I took out my phone and looked at the name Margaret had left me. Patricia Okafor, attorney at law, Bakersfield. There were 11 missed calls on my phone, 7 from Diane, 4 from a number I didn't recognize. I didn't listen to any of the voicemails. I opened a new call and dialed the attorney's number. It rang twice. Patricia Okafor. Her voice was direct and unhurried. "My name is Nathan Mercer," I said. "My wife was Margaret Mercer. She told me to call you if things went badly." A brief pause. Not surprise, more like recognition. "Mr. Mercer, I've been expecting your call. How bad did it get?" I looked out at the desert. The sun was fully up now, casting hard shadows across the cracked earth, and somewhere out in the scrub something was moving. A hawk, maybe, circling high above the land that was mine. "Bad enough," I said, "but I found what she left me." "Good." I heard the click of a keyboard. "Can you be in my office tomorrow morning?" "I can be there this afternoon." Another pause, and this time I thought I heard something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Even better. Don't call your daughter back. Don't respond to anyone from Carson Wells until we've spoken. And Mr. Mercer, don't leave that property unattended overnight. Lock the barn." I looked back at the padlock still in my hand. "Already on it," I said. Patricia Okafor's office was on the 3rd floor of a building in downtown Bakersfield that smelled like old carpet and printer toner, which somehow made me trust it immediately. No marble lobby, no receptionist who looked like she'd been hired for her cheekbones. Just a waiting room with mismatched chairs and a coffee pot that had seen better decades. And then Patricia herself, who opened her office door before I even sat down and said, "Mr. Mercer, come in." She was somewhere in her mid-50s, a compact woman with close-cropped natural hair going gray at the temples, and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead in a way that reminded me so sharply of Margaret that I had to look at the wall for a second before I could respond normally. Her desk was organized the way serious people organize things. Not neat for the sake of appearance, but structured for function, stacks that meant something, files that were reachable without searching. Margaret spoke highly of you, I said, sitting down. She was one of the sharpest clients I've ever had, Patricia said. No past tense hesitation, no condolence pause. She read me correctly and understood I didn't need softening. She also prepared me well. I know the broad strokes of what happened after she passed. I want to hear your version. I told her everything. The morning with the documents, the 3 signatures, the drained accounts, the changed keypad code, the motel, the farm, the vault, the letter. Patricia took notes on a legal pad and did not interrupt once, which is rarer than it sounds. When I finished, she set her pen down and looked at me directly. The document they described as standard probate paperwork, she said. The 3rd one you signed. Yeah. That was a pre-prepared power of attorney with an unusually broad scope. Margaret warned me they might attempt something like that. The question is enforceability, given the circumstances under which you signed it, the timing, your state of grief, and whether full disclosure was made. The answer, in my professional opinion, is that we have a strong argument for coercion and misrepresentation. She paused. It won't be instant, but it's real. What about the money they moved? Wire transfers of that size leave complete records. We can trace every dollar. Getting it back is a different process than proving it was taken wrongly, but both are possible. She tapped her pen against the legal pad. What Margaret left you on that property, particularly the water rights documentation and the vehicle collection, that's where the real weight is. The hydrological survey she commissioned is thorough. I've read it. A hydrogeologist I work with has also reviewed it and agreed with the conclusions. Mr. Mercer, the aquifer under that land is not a secondary resource. It is the primary underground water source in that formation. Carson's development project is permitted based on projected water access that, without your property, does not legally exist. I sat with that for a moment. He knows that. He absolutely knows that. Which means returning to that property and pressuring you to transfer the deed was always part of the plan. The farm wasn't an oversight in how they structured the will outcome. It was the next step. She leaned back in her chair. They gave you the farm because they intended to take it from you on their own timeline, once they'd isolated you and depleted your resources. The cold focus I'd felt in the motel room the night of Margaret's burial settled back into me, cleaner and more specific now. What do we do? Several things simultaneously, Patricia said. First, we begin the legal process to challenge the power of attorney document and the wire transfers. I've already drafted the initial filings. Margaret paid a retainer that covered preparatory work, and I've been ready to move since the day she passed. Second, we secure your assets. The vehicle collection needs to be formally appraised and the titles verified and filed. I have an appraiser I trust who can be at the property within the week. Third, and this is the part that requires something from you specifically, we need time. How much time? Enough to get the evidence package to the right people. Margaret's forensic files on Carson's previous investment schemes, Ruth Haddad's analyses, the fund routing documentation, the pattern across 3 separate projects, that goes to the SEC field office and potentially to federal investigators, depending on the scale of what they find when they open it up. That process, once started, moves on its own timeline. We can't rush it, but we need it moving before Carson moves on you. I looked at her. You think he's going to move soon? I think he's going to move the moment he believes the water rights situation is at risk of becoming complicated. She met my eyes steadily. Has he contacted you? Diane has called 7 times, 4 calls from an unknown number. Don't answer any of them yet. When they come to the property, and they will come to the property, I need you to not be the man who found what's in that vault. I need you to be the man they think you are. Confused, tired, a little lost, an old widower camping on a broken farm he doesn't understand, still grieving, not quite keeping up with the paperwork. I understood what she was asking. I had spent 30 years in construction management, which means I had spent 30 years in rooms where the other side was trying to assess what you knew and what you didn't know. And the single most powerful tool you had was controlling what they concluded. You want me to perform? I want you to buy us 48 hours once they arrive. Think you can do that? I thought about Carson sitting across from me at my dining room table with his folder and his practiced handshake, explaining the will update in that smooth, patient voice while Diane held my hand and the documents were already waiting. I thought about how confident he had been, how certain that I would simply accept what was placed in front of me. "Yeah," I said, "I can do that." The week that followed was the strangest of my life, and I say that having just buried my wife and discovered a secret vault under a barn in the desert. Patricia moved fast. The appraiser, a quiet, heavy-set man named Gerald, who wore the same windbreaker every day and spoke about automobiles the way surgeons speak about anatomy, arrived at the farm 2 days after my meeting with Patricia and spent an entire day in the vault. He emerged with a written preliminary assessment that made me sit down. The Ferrari 250 GT alone was authenticated and valued at $4.2 million. The full collection, conservatively, was worth north of $11 million. "Your wife," Gerald told me, pulling off his reading glasses and rubbing his face, "bought extremely well over a very long period of time and stored everything correctly. This is one of the best-maintained private collections I've assessed in 20 years. Margaret. Buying well over a very long period of time. I almost smiled. The water rights attorney Patricia brought in, a man named Desmond who practiced environmental and property law and apparently testified before state water boards with some regularity, spent 2 days reviewing the hydrological survey and the county records. His conclusion was delivered with the precision of an expert who had made a career of saying exactly what the evidence supported and nothing more. The water rights attached to this property, properly filed and legally defensible, represented a controlling interest in the only viable water source for the entire development zone Carson had permitted. Without easement or purchase of those rights, the project's environmental permits would fail on reapplication. He said this while standing in the barn with his sleeves rolled up and a coffee from the gas station 2 miles down the highway, and the matter-of-fact weight of it hit me the same way load calculations used to hit me when I was reviewing a structure and realized the numbers meant something decisive. Carson hadn't built a trap for me. He had walked into one Margaret had spent years preparing. The evidence package for the federal investigators took the longest. Ruth Haddad, Margaret's forensic contact, a 70-year-old former SEC investigator with iron posture and an absolute intolerance for sloppy documentation, drove out to the farm on the 3rd day and spent 6 hours at the desk in the vault going through the files she had originally prepared. She added to them, updated certain analyses, and by the time she climbed those concrete stairs at the end of the afternoon, she had a flash drive and a bound folder that she pressed into my hands with the seriousness of someone handing over something they'd built with their own effort and their own integrity. "Your wife was methodical," Ruth said. "This is solid, not circumstantial, documented, sourced, and traceable. The routing structures Carson used across 3 projects are consistent enough to establish pattern evidence, and the scale of the current project makes this federal, not state." She looked at me over her glasses. "I know people at the field office, not in a corrupt way, in a we've worked together for 30 years way. I'll make the call." "Thank you," I said. She shrugged, which I think was the equivalent of a lengthy emotional speech from someone like Ruth. "Margaret asked me to help her protect her husband. I'm finishing what I started." I spent those nights in the farmhouse, which was significantly less comfortable than the motel, but mine in a way the motel never was. I patched the worst draft gaps with materials from a hardware store in the nearest town, ran an extension cord from the barn's electrical system for light and a space heater, and slept on a cot I bought at a camping supply place. It wasn't comfortable. It also wasn't the worst sleeping situation of my life. I'd spent 2 weeks on a job site in Wyoming in my 40s in a trailer where the heat worked approximately 40% of the time, and I hadn't died from that either. What kept me up was not the discomfort. It was the waiting. And the phone. Diane had stopped calling after the 3rd day of no response, which told me something. Carson, I suspected, had told her to stop, to let the silence do the work, to let me feel the isolation and the resource depletion and the grief until I was soft enough to approach. He was operating on a timeline. He had investors expecting movement on the development project. He needed the water rights resolved, which meant he needed my property, which meant he was going to run out of patience soon. He ran out on day 6. I was eating crackers and canned soup, the farm diet of a man with limited options, when I heard the sound of vehicles on the dirt road, 2 sets of headlights through the cracked window. I checked my watch, 8:47 in the evening. I called Patricia first. 1 ring. "They're here," I said. "Remember what we talked about," she said. "Call me the moment they leave. Keep your phone recording in your shirt pocket." I set the recording running, tucked the phone in, and went to the door. 2 vehicles, Carson's Mercedes and a black SUV I didn't recognize. Carson got out of the Mercedes, dressed in dark slacks and a jacket despite the desert evening, looking like a man who had driven 200 miles and was not happy about it. Diane got out of the passenger side. She was in jeans and a blouse, her hair pulled back, and she looked, not guilty exactly, but like someone who had made a decision they were committed to and wasn't going to revisit. 2 men got out of the SUV. They were large and quiet and did not introduce themselves, and they positioned themselves slightly behind and to either side of Carson in a way that was not subtle. I stood in the doorway of the farmhouse and let them come to me. I made sure my posture said what Patricia and I had discussed. Slightly hunched, slightly uncertain, a man who had been alone for 6 days with his grief in a broken house. "Dad," Diane said. She said it the way she'd said it that morning at the kitchen table, with a practiced gentleness that I now heard clearly for what it was. "We've been worried about you." "I didn't hear from you," I said. I let my voice come out older than it was, slower. "We called," she said. "You didn't pick up." "I didn't. I've been having trouble with the phone. The signal out here." I looked at Carson. "Carson." "Nathan." He stepped onto the porch, past Diane, which was a small thing but deliberate, putting himself physically in front of her. "Can we come inside?" I stepped back and let them in. The 2 men from the SUV stayed on the porch. Carson looked around the farmhouse interior with an expression he didn't fully control. Quick, assessing, calculating. He was looking for signs of what I'd found. The barn door was closed and padlocked, and had been since Gerald left, and I'd been careful not to leave anything that indicated I'd been inside it. He looked at the crackers on the table, the cot visible through the back doorway, the space heater. "Nathan," he said, and his voice shifted, still measured, but with something underneath it now, a kind of deliberate authority. "We need to talk about the property." "Okay," I said. I sat down in one of the 2 chairs at the table, slowly. I did not offer them the other chair. Carson pulled it out and sat down anyway. Diane remained standing near the door, her arms crossed. "We've had some conversations with the development group about this land," Carson said. "There may be some interest in purchasing it. It would be a significant amount of money, Nathan, more than this place is worth on the open market." "How much?" I asked. "We'd need to talk through the details, but we're looking at somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000. He said it carefully, like it was a reasonable number for a crumbling desert property, which it was, if you didn't know what the property was actually worth. I let a silence sit there. I looked at the table. I did the thing that Patricia and I had discussed. I performed hesitation that looked like confusion. "I don't know," I said slowly. "Margaret wanted me to have this place." "Margaret would have wanted you to be comfortable," Diane said from near the door. Her voice had an edge in it that she was containing. "Dad, you're living on a cot in a house with a broken roof. This isn't what she would have wanted for you." "I don't know," I said again. "I'd have to think about it." Carson leaned forward slightly. "The thing is, Nathan, there's a timeline on this. The development group needs to move on the water rights question within a few weeks. After that, the window closes." A pause. "And there's something else we need to discuss. We've been in contact with a physician about some of the concerns we've had regarding your decision-making recently. It's not an accusation. It's a wellness check. There's a process if a family member has concerns about a parent's cognitive capacity." There it was. I had expected it. Patricia had predicted it almost word for word. But hearing it said out loud in my wife's uncle's farmhouse by my son-in-law, with 2 large men standing on the porch outside, still landed like something physical. They were going to try to have me declared incompetent. I let my face do something uncertain and frightened, which was not entirely acting because some part of me, the part that was still just a 71-year-old man who had buried his wife 12 days ago, was frightened. A wellness check, I repeated. It's just to make sure you're okay, Diane said. The edge in her voice had smoothed out into something almost gentle. Almost. We're worried, Dad. You've been out here alone. You didn't answer our calls. You're not yourself. What does that mean? I asked. A wellness check? There would be a physician's evaluation, Carson said, and then potentially a legal process, just to make sure you have the right support in place. It's not something to be scared of. What he was actually saying, in the clean translation that Patricia had given me in advance, was this. If I didn't cooperate on the property sale, they would initiate a guardianship proceeding, which would give a court-appointed guardian legal authority over my financial decisions, effectively removing my ability to control or sell or encumber the property without court approval, during which time Carson would find a way to either get a favorable ruling or delay things long enough to damage the development window and pressure me further. It was a sophisticated move. It would have worked on a man who was actually as isolated and confused as they believed me to be. I don't want any trouble, I said. I made my voice smaller. Can you give me a little time to think? I've been having some trouble keeping track of things. It's been a hard few weeks. Carson looked at me. He was assessing the way he always was, running calculations behind those flat, careful eyes. He was looking for resistance and not finding any. He was seeing exactly what he expected to see. A broken old man sitting in a dying farmhouse, alone, depleted, compliant. Of course, he said, and his voice relaxed into something magnanimous. He had decided he was winning. We can give you a couple of days, but Nathan, I want to be direct with you. The best thing for everyone here is if we handle this property transfer cleanly without involving the courts. It's simpler, it's faster, and it's better for you. I nodded. I looked at my hands on the table. Okay, I said. A couple of days. He stood, smoothed his jacket, glanced around the room one more time. Diane said, "Good night, Dad," in the soft, careful voice and touched my shoulder briefly as she passed. I sat still and let them leave. I heard the vehicles start. I heard them go back up the dirt road. I sat in that chair for exactly 90 seconds. Then I straightened up, pulled my phone out of my shirt pocket, stopped the recording, and called Patricia. They showed it, I said. The competency threat. On the recording. Perfect. She didn't sound surprised. She sounded like someone who had been waiting for a confirmation. That's coercive conduct during an estate matter, combined with the wire transfers and the fraudulent power of attorney. Nathan, they just handed us the rest of what we needed. A pause. Did they give you a timeline? A couple of days. Good. That's all we need. Ruth made the call to the field office this afternoon. They've already been in contact with her. The pattern evidence across Carson's previous projects was enough to open a preliminary inquiry. The water rights documentation goes to the county recorder first thing tomorrow. Gerald's appraisal report is finalized. A brief pause that felt like someone collecting themselves before the next move. By the time your 48 hours is up, Carson Wells is going to find that the board under his entire project has been removed, and he's not going to see it coming until it's already done. I stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the dark desert. No lights on the road now, just the flat, silent land and the stars above it. A sky full of them out here, the way you only got when there were no city lights for miles. Patricia, I said, the investment ceremony, the one where he's presenting to the big capital group. 4 days from now, she said. The Castellan Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. We've already confirmed the date and venue. I thought about Carson in my dining room with his folder and his practiced handshake. I thought about Diane holding my hand while I signed documents I didn't understand. I thought about my debit card declining over $40 of groceries. I thought about Margaret writing that letter in her shaky final handwriting, telling me she was sorry she couldn't warn me sooner, telling me not to let them win. I want to be there, I said. A beat of silence, then, I was hoping you'd say that. I set the phone down and stood in the quiet farmhouse for a long time. Outside, the desert was still and dark and looked like nothing. Looked like a place a man had been sent to disappear. I was still standing there when I realized my hands were completely steady, and had been for the last 4 days, and that somewhere in the process of reading my wife's letter and climbing out of that vault and sitting across from Patricia Okafor and eating crackers in this broken house, the grief had not lessened. It would never lessen, not really. But something had clarified inside me. Margaret had loved me well enough to protect me when she couldn't do it in person. The least I could do was be worth protecting. I went to bed on the cot and slept better than I had in 2 weeks. The drive to Los Angeles took 3.5 hours, and I spent most of it in silence. Patricia had offered to send a car, which I declined. I needed those 3.5 hours to myself. Not to rehearse anything, not to plan, but just to sit with what was about to happen and make sure I was the right kind of ready. There's a difference between being prepared and being cold, and I needed to be both. And those are not always the same thing when the person you are walking into a room to confront is your own daughter. I had bought a suit. Nothing extravagant. A dark charcoal from a department store in Bakersfield that Patricia's assistant had helped me select over the phone, because I had not purchased a suit since Margaret's work Christmas party 4 years ago, and my body had changed since then in the ways that bodies change when a man stops paying attention to himself. It fit well enough. I had it pressed at the dry cleaner 2 doors down from Patricia's building. I wore the tie Margaret had given me for our 38th anniversary, a deep navy silk that she had picked out herself and presented over breakfast saying, "You never buy ties you actually like, so I'm handling it." I wore it for her. The Castellan Hotel was the kind of place that communicated wealth without advertising it, a downtown Los Angeles property that had been restored from a 1920s building and wore its history with a quiet confidence. Wide lobby with a coffered ceiling. Staff who moved without urgency because they had been trained to appear unhurried regardless of what they were managing. A ballroom on the second floor that, according to the event listing Patricia's assistant had pulled, was booked under Wells Capital Partners Investment Showcase. I arrived at 4:15. The event was scheduled to begin at 5. Patricia was waiting for me near the lobby entrance alongside Desmond, the water rights attorney, and a younger man named Kevin who worked in her office and had spent the previous 2 days preparing the documentation packages. Patricia looked at me when I walked in, suit, tie, the posture of a man who had made a decision and finished making it, and gave a single nod that said everything it needed to. "Ruth confirmed the field office contact will be present in the building from 4:30, she said quietly, falling into step beside me. "Not in the ballroom initially. They'll be monitoring. The recording from the farm visit has been formally submitted. The water rights filing was confirmed by the county recorder's office this morning at 9:17. Carson knows about the filing? He will within the next hour, if he doesn't already. His attorney will have flagged it. That's why the timing tonight matters. Once he knows the water rights are formally recorded and legally defensible, he'll know the project's permitting is in jeopardy, and his instinct will be to manage the investors in that room before the information spreads." She glanced at me. "He'll want to contain it." "We're not going to let him contain it." Kevin handed me a leather portfolio. Inside were 3 sets of documents, organized by tabbed section. The recorded water rights filing, the legal challenge to the fraudulent power of attorney, and the wire transfer records, and a condensed version of Ruth's forensic analysis covering Carson's 3 prior investment structures. Patricia had prepared a matching package for each of the 12 principal investors who were confirmed to be attending the evening's presentation. "We hand these to the investors directly?" I asked. "After he begins his presentation," Patricia said. "Not before. I want him in the middle of his pitch when this lands. I don't want him to have time to reframe it before they've already heard his version." She was matter-of-fact about it in the way that told me she had been in rooms like this before and understood that timing in a situation like this was not strategy. It was everything. "Kevin will handle distribution to the investors while you address the room. I'll be positioned near the door. Desmond has a statement prepared for any questions about the water rights filing." I looked around the lobby. Well-dressed people moving through, staff arranging things for the evening. A banner near the elevator bank that read, "Wells Capital Partners" in clean sans serif font with a rendering of a gleaming architectural complex beneath it. The futuristic city Carson had been selling to anyone willing to listen. "One more thing," Patricia said. She stopped walking and turned to face me directly. When you walk into that ballroom, you are not a victim making a scene. You are a property owner with documented legal standing, represented by counsel, presenting verified information to parties with a material interest in receiving it. You are not there to embarrass your daughter. You are not there for revenge. You are there because those investors deserve to know what they're funding before they commit. A pause. Can you hold on to that when it gets hard in there? I thought about Margaret. Not the sick version, not the letter version, just Margaret at the kitchen table 30 years ago, looking at a problem with a legal pad and a pencil and saying, "Okay, let's figure out what we actually have." "Yes," I said. The ballroom was arranged with round tables for the investors and a raised presentation area at the front. Podium, screen, the kind of lighting that makes everything look like a commercial. By 4:50, most of the seats were filled, 12 principal investors and their associates, which meant the room held perhaps 30 people in total. The table arrangements suggested a dinner to follow the presentation. There were centerpieces and good glassware and the low pre-event murmur of people who were used to being in rooms like this one. I had been told by the hotel's event coordinator, who Patricia had spoken with earlier in the day, that I could stand in the reception area adjacent to the ballroom until the event began. I used that time to look through the glass panel in the door at the room inside. Carson was near the front, talking to a cluster of men who had the comfortable body language of wealth long held. He was in a dark suit, animated, working the room. Good at it. He had always been good at it. Diane was at a side table with two women I didn't recognize. She was dressed in a deep red, and her hair was down, and she looked, from a distance, like a woman at ease at a successful event. I watched her laugh at something one of the women said and felt, not nothing exactly, but something with a lid on it. Something I had decided I would feel later, in private, with more time than I currently had. Carson moved to the podium at 5:02. "Good evening," he said, and his voice in that microphone was the best version of itself. Warm, confident, with just enough informality to suggest he was among friends. "I want to thank each of you for being here. What we're presenting tonight is, I genuinely believe, the most significant project of my career, and frankly one of the most important development opportunities in the Western United States in the last 2 decades. He clicked to his first slide. The architectural rendering filled the screen, gleaming towers, green spaces, the visual language of a future that looked like money. I opened the ballroom door and walked in. I was not running. I was not performing anger. I was walking the way I used to walk onto a job site when something had gone structurally wrong, and I was the engineer who understood why, with the particular authority of a person who knows exactly what they're looking at and is not confused by it. Carson saw me when I was about 10 feet inside the door. I watched his face go through something he couldn't stop. A flicker of surprise, then a quick recalibration, then the attempt to reassert the smooth surface. He did it in under 2 seconds, which told me he had prepared for the possibility of disruption, just not this specific disruption. "Nathan," he said into the microphone with a kind of controlled geniality that said to the room, "This is a minor thing. I'm handling it. This is a private event." "I'm aware," I said. My voice carried without the microphone. 30 years of job sites and noisy construction environments will do that for you. "I won't take much of your time. These people deserve about 10 minutes before they commit to anything, and I think they'll agree with me once they've heard it." The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something real begins to happen. I could feel it, the shift in attention, 30 people recalibrating what kind of evening this was going to be. "Security," Carson started. "I am the legal owner of the primary water source for this development project," I said, and I said it to the room, not to Carson. "My name is Nathan Mercer. My attorney has filed the water rights documentation with the Kern County Recorder's Office as of 9/17 this morning, without an easement or purchase agreement with me, which does not exist. The environmental permits for this project will not survive reapplication." I looked at the investors. "Kevin?" Kevin moved along the tables, placing folders in front of each principal investor with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done exactly this kind of work before. "What's in front of you," I continued, "is the recorded water rights filing, a legal summary of the property's status, and documentation related to 2 prior investment projects managed by Carson Wells that resulted in significant investor losses through fund routing structures that a former SEC investigator has characterized in writing as consistent with fraudulent conduct. The room erupted, not loudly, but decisively. The low murmur of wealth jolted into the sharper sound of people sitting up and looking at each other and opening the folders in front of them. Carson came off the podium. He crossed the room fast, and when he reached me, he put himself close, not quite in my space, but close enough to be read as a physical assertion. His voice dropped to the register he used when he had decided charm was not the right tool. "You are making a serious mistake," he said. "You are not well, Nathan. Everyone here can see that. You're a grieving old man who has been manipulated by my wife," I said. "Yes. She manipulated me into having legal ownership of land your entire project depends on. She manipulated me into having forensic documentation of your last 3 investment structures. And she manipulated me into hiring Patricia Okafor." I paused. She was a very capable woman. Something moved across Carson's face. Not guilt. Guilt would have required him to have a version of himself that knew what guilt felt like. What I saw was something more reptilian, a rapid assessment of the situation and the conclusion that it was worse than he had calculated. "This is defamation," he said. "It's documentation," I said. "There's a difference. The people in this room can read." He took out his phone. I watched him look at the screen. I saw the moment he found it, the county recorder notification or his attorney's message about it, or both. Because his jaw tightened in a way he couldn't prevent. The water rights filing. The one piece of the structure he had been certain he would obtain quietly, from a broken and isolated old man on a desert farm, before anyone else knew it existed. "Carson?" One of the investors, a heavy-set man near the front table who I later learned managed a private equity fund out of San Francisco, spoke in the voice of someone who had not come here to watch a family argument. "Is any of what this man is saying accurate? The water rights?" "It's being handled," Carson said. He was still looking at his phone. He looked up. "There's been a miscommunication about the property filing. My legal team is—" "A miscommunication," the man said flatly. He had the folder open in front of him now, and he was reading it with the focused attention of a person for whom documents were a primary language. "This says the filing was completed this morning. This also says the project's current environmental permit was issued based on projected water access that requires easement from this property." He looked up. "Is that correct? There are legal options? Is that correct?" The silence that followed was the most specific silence I had ever been in. It had a shape to it. Carson was standing in the middle of a room full of people who had been on the verge of committing hundreds of millions of dollars to a project, and they were looking at him with the particular expression of people who have just understood that what they were being sold and what they were actually buying were not the same thing. "I need 5 minutes," Carson said. "I can explain the water rights situation in context." "I don't think 5 minutes covers the other 2 projects in this folder," said a woman at a table on the far side. Younger, sharp-faced, with the file open to Ruth's analysis. "Fund routing through subsidiary structures in both cases. Investor losses. Your personal exit prior to collapse in both instances." She looked at him over the pages. "I'd want more than 5 minutes for that." That was when Diane stood up. She was across the room, and I had been tracking her peripherally the whole time, watching her face change as the room changed around her. She had started the evening in the comfortable posture of a woman at a successful event, and she had moved through surprise and into something that I could not fully read from across the ballroom. Now she was standing, and her face was not the careful managed face she had worn at my kitchen table the morning after the funeral. It was something rawer than that, something that might, under different circumstances, have been the beginning of actual feeling. "Dad," she said. Her voice in the room was strange, too familiar for the setting, too much history in that single word. "Dad, can we talk about this outside? Just the 2 of us?" I looked at her. My daughter. The little girl. All of that. "There's nothing to talk about outside this room that isn't better said in here," I said. "These people have a right to this information. I'm not doing this to hurt you, Diane. I'm doing it because your husband has been defrauding investors for 6 years, and he was planning to use my wife's land to do it again, And my wife spent the last 2 years of her life making sure he couldn't. My voice held. I had not been certain it would. I'm not the one who decided this was how things were going to be. You made that choice. Both of you made that choice. She sat back down. Her face had closed back over whatever had opened in it, and I turned away because I had to. The door at the back of the ballroom opened. 3 people came in, and they did not look like hotel staff or event guests. They wore the specific kind of purposeful neutral that federal investigators wear when they enter a room and want everyone to understand the nature of their authority without having to announce it. Patricia had moved to stand near the side wall, and I saw her make eye contact with the lead investigator, the confirming look of someone whose call had been answered. Carson saw them. His whole body registered it in a way that clothing could not entirely hide. A stillness, a recalibration, and then the surface composure attempting to reassemble over something that had already broken underneath. One of the investigators approached him and spoke quietly. I was close enough to hear fragments. "Mr. Wells, federal financial crimes, we'd like you to come with us. You can call your attorney from—" "I have rights," Carson said. His voice had finally lost the polish. It came out flat and hard and smaller than usual. "I want my attorney present before—" "Absolutely," the investigator said, with the patient, unhurried tone of someone who has had this conversation many times. "You can call on the way." What happened in the next 4 minutes I watched from 10 feet away, standing in a ballroom in a charcoal suit with a navy tie, and I want to be honest with you about what I felt because I promised myself I would be honest about all of it. I did not feel triumph. I am not built for triumph. It has always seemed to me like a feeling that belongs to people who enjoy conflict, and I have never enjoyed conflict. What I felt was closer to completion. The particular feeling of a load-bearing calculation that has finally come back right. Carson walked out with the investigators. He did not look at me as he passed. He did not look at Diane. She watched him go. And then she looked at me, and this time the managed face was completely gone, and what was underneath it was something I recognized. Not the daughter who had sat across from me with a folder and a practiced smile, but something further back than that. Something from before Carson, before the money, before whatever series of decisions had brought her to this room. She looked for just a moment like someone who understood exactly how far they had fallen and could see no way back up. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I walked to where Patricia was standing. "The water rights are secure?" I asked, because that was the practical thing, and I needed a practical thing to hold on to. "Filed and confirmed," she said. "Carson's attorney will challenge, but Desmond gives it a 90% chance of holding. The documentation is too thorough." She paused. "Ruth's materials were enough to open a formal investigation. What happens after that is not in our hands, but the field office doesn't open formal inquiries without reasonable cause. They had more than reasonable cause." Around us, the ballroom had dissolved into the organized chaos of a room full of people who had come expecting a dinner and were now making urgent calls to their own attorneys. The Wells Capital Partners banner was still on the screen above the empty podium, the architectural rendering of the gleaming future city still glowing behind it, untouched by any of what had just happened in the room beneath it. I looked at it for a moment. All that polish, all that careful constructed vision of something that had never been real. Then I picked up my portfolio, nodded to Patricia, and walked out of the Castellan Hotel into the Los Angeles evening. The air outside was cool and smelled like the city, exhaust and concrete, and something indefinable that is particular to large places after dark. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment without moving, just breathing. My hands were steady. My heart was beating at a perfectly ordinary rate. Somewhere to my east, in a room above me, 30 investors were reading documents that would restructure the next several months of their financial lives. Somewhere in a federal building not far from here, Carson Wells was making a phone call to the most expensive attorney he could reach. And somewhere behind me, if I turned around, Diane was still sitting in a ballroom full of strangers, alone for the first time in a long time, in a red dress with the folder open in front of her. I didn't turn around. I had a 3.5-hour drive back to the farm, and the desert was waiting, and the barn was locked, and beneath the barn the cars sat gleaming in their climate-controlled silence. Margaret's cars. Margaret's files. Margaret's careful, precise, devastating love. I walked to the parking structure and found my truck, and I got in and I drove. The drive back from Los Angeles that night took longer than 3.5 hours, because somewhere past Bakersfield, I pulled off the highway at a rest stop and sat in the truck for 40 minutes without doing anything in particular. I wasn't crying. I wasn't thinking strategically. I was just sitting in a dark parking lot with the engine off and the desert air coming through the cracked window, doing what I think the human body sometimes demands after it has been holding itself together under pressure for too long. Absolutely nothing. Just breathing. Just existing in a moment that didn't require anything from me yet. The stars were out. That far from the city, they were the real thing, the full sky that people who grow up in urban places don't understand until they see it the first time. Margaret and I had taken a road trip through Nevada 15 years ago, and she had made me pull over on a 2-lane highway at midnight just to stand outside and look up. I had thought it was a little impractical at the time. I had been wrong about that, the way I was wrong about a number of things over the years, the way people are wrong about things when they're moving too fast through their own life to notice what's actually around them. I thought about her for a long time in that rest stop. Not the strategic Margaret, not the Margaret who had built a vault and gathered forensic files and outmaneuvered everyone who underestimated her. Just my wife. The person who had sat across from me at breakfast for 4 decades and knew when I was lying about being fine and called me on it every single time, without cruelty and without hesitation. The person who had loved our daughter the way you love someone you can see clearly, all the way through, including the parts that hurt to look at. She had known what Diane was becoming, and she had still loved her. She had just stopped letting love be the same thing as permission. I needed to learn that distinction. I was 71 years old, and I was only learning it now, which is both embarrassing and, I think, deeply human. I started the truck and drove the rest of the way to the farm. The weeks that followed moved in 2 registers simultaneously. The legal machinery, which was grinding and procedural and required my attention at regular intervals, and the personal reality, which was quieter and stranger and harder to explain. On the legal side, things moved with the kind of momentum that happens when documentation is overwhelming and the pattern of conduct is clear. The federal inquiry into Carson's investment structures was formally opened within 10 days of the Castellan Hotel. Ruth's forensic analysis, combined with records the investigators subpoenaed from Carson's corporate entities, established the fund routing pattern across all 3 prior projects, with a precision that, according to Patricia, made the case significantly stronger than she had initially projected. 2 of the investors from the ballroom that evening, including the heavyset man from San Francisco who had asked the direct questions, voluntarily provided statements and additional financial records that filled gaps in the documentary trail. Carson was arrested formally 6 weeks after the hotel. The charges, when they came, were substantial: securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud across multiple jurisdictions. His attorney, who was expensive and competent, negotiated hard in the preliminary hearings. None of it changed the weight of what was documented. The house I had built my marriage in, where Diane had grown up, where Margaret had died, was seized as part of the asset freeze on Carson's holdings, because it had been transferred into a jointly held entity structure shortly after the will was executed, which Patricia said was either extraordinarily convenient or extraordinarily stupid, depending on how you looked at it. She believed it was both. The fraudulent power of attorney was successfully challenged in court, and the wire transfers, all $260,000 of them, were traced, frozen, and returned to me over the following 3 months, arriving in installments that Patricia tracked with the obsessive thoroughness of someone who had built her career on not letting opposing counsel find places to hide money. The water rights held. Desmond's 90% confidence turned out to be accurate. Carson's legal team challenged the filing on 3 separate technical grounds and lost all 3. The development project, the gleaming futuristic city on the rendering that had been glowing on the screen above an empty podium, collapsed without the water rights and without its lead developer, and without the investors who had been in that ballroom and were now collectively pursuing their own legal remedies. The permits expired. The subsidiary companies were unwound. The whole architecture of it came apart, the way structures always come apart, when the foundational calculation was wrong from the beginning. I watched all of this from the farm. That might seem strange, that I stayed on the farm while my legal situation was being resolved, while a house I had lived in for 30 years sat empty and contested 200 miles away. But I had made a decision, sometime in those 40 minutes at the rest stop, that I was not going back to that house even if I could. Not because of what Diane and Carson had done there, though that was part of it, but because it had been Margaret's house in the way that mattered, and Margaret was gone, and the version of my life that house represented was over. The farm was something different. The farm was what came next. I am not a romantic man. I want to be clear about that. I am an engineer. I think in load capacities and drainage gradients and material tensile strength. But there was something about that land, the flat, honest desert of it, the way it asked nothing of you and concealed everything, that had gotten into me during those first weeks and hadn't let go. I had arrived expecting nothing and found the full weight of my wife's love buried 60 feet under a barn floor. That does something to a person. It recalibrates what you think you know about what a place can hold. I fixed the farmhouse roof first, hired a local crew from the nearest town, 2 brothers and a nephew who worked construction and didn't ask many questions and did solid work. We replaced the collapsed eastern section, reinforced the framing, put on a new metal roof that would handle the occasional desert rain and the heat and the decades. I did some of the work myself, which the brothers thought was either admirable or insane for a man my age, and which I did partly because I am still capable of it, and partly because there is something about physical work that quiets the interior noise in a way that nothing else quite matches. I got the porch level again, fixed the windows, ran new electrical through the farmhouse off the barn system, which was already robust because Margaret had built it to support the vault's climate control. By the end of the second month, the farmhouse was not beautiful, but it was solid, which has always seemed to me the more important quality. Gerald, the appraiser, returned with a colleague to complete the full authentication and appraisal documentation on the vehicle collection. The final certified total came in at $14.3 million, which was higher than the preliminary estimate because the Gullwing's provenance documentation, a meticulous file Margaret had assembled over 20 years of careful acquisition, turned out to be exceptionally complete, and complete provenance on a car like that moves the number significantly. Gerald told me, standing in the vault with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, that in 30 years of working with private collections, he had rarely seen documentation this thorough. Your wife, he said, for the second time since we'd met, was extraordinary. I left the cars in the vault. Not forever. I had conversations with 2 auction houses and a private collector network about eventual disposition, and Patricia's office was handling the estate tax implications, which were considerable. But for the time being, I left them where Margaret had put them, in the climate-controlled silence under the desert floor, because moving them felt premature. Like I hadn't finished being in the same space as her choices yet. It was in the 3rd month that Diane called. I had been expecting it, not hoping for it, not dreading it exactly, just knowing it would come, the way you know weather is coming when the light changes in a certain way. I was on the porch when the phone rang, drinking coffee in the early morning, watching a hawk work the updrafts above the scrub line. I picked up. Dad. Her voice was different than it had been. Not the managed softness of the kitchen table morning, not the controlled distress of the ballroom. It was flatter than either of those. Emptier. The voice of someone who has been living in the wreckage of their own decisions long enough that the shock has worn off, and what's left is just the ongoing fact of it. Can we talk? We're talking now, I said. A pause. I know I don't have any right to ask you for anything. That's accurate, I said, not with heat, just as a statement of fact. I'm not living in the house anymore. They seized it. I'm staying with a friend. Another pause. Carson and I are... The marriage is over. I filed. She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed because saying them unrehearsed is too destabilizing. I don't know if that matters to you. It matters, I said. Not in the way you might think. It just matters. Dad, I need you to understand something. Her voice changed, tightened into something that was trying to hold back more than it could. I knew what Carson was doing. Not everything, not all of it, but enough. I knew the wire transfers weren't. I told myself it was estate management. I told myself you'd be fine. I kept telling myself things that let me not look at what I was actually doing. A long silence on the line. I don't have an excuse. I've been sitting here for 3 months, trying to find language that makes what I did something other than what it was, and there isn't any. I chose him over you. I chose money over my family. And Mom she already knew. She already saw it. And I let her die thinking her daughter was that person. I sat with that for a moment. The hawk was still up there, riding the warm air above the desert, not working especially hard, just using what the environment provided. I had been watching birds of prey out here with a new kind of attention. They were honest creatures. They didn't perform anything. Your mother didn't die thinking you were a lost cause, I said finally. She died loving you and being clear-eyed about what you'd become, and understanding those weren't the same thing. She was a complicated woman. She could hold more than one true thing at a time. Diane made a sound that wasn't quite crying but was adjacent to it. I'm sorry, Dad. I know it doesn't fix anything. No, I said. It doesn't. Is there anything I can do? I thought about the question honestly, because she deserved an honest answer rather than a kind one. Not right now, I said. Maybe not for a long time. I don't know yet. What I know is that I'm not going to tell you that it's fine when it isn't, and I'm not going to pretend that an apology on the phone undoes what happened. I'm also not going to tell you that you're permanently beyond anything, because I don't believe that about people. But where we go from here, if we go anywhere, that's going to be built out of what you actually do over time, not what you say. She was quiet for a long moment. That's fair, she said softly. I need you to do something for me, I said. Not for my sake, for yours. Get yourself a lawyer who has nothing to do with Carson's world, and make sure you're protected from the fallout of what he did. I don't know what exposure you have legally, and I can't help you with that, but you need someone competent in your corner who isn't compromised. I paused. Your mother would have told you the same thing. I know. A breath. Dad? Did she? In the letter she left you, did she say anything about me? I looked out at the desert. The hawk had drifted further east now, a small dark shape against the pale morning sky. What Margaret had written about Diane in that letter was between a mother and the husband she trusted with it. Some of it was sorrow, some of it was clear-eyed assessment, and some of it, the last part of the section about Diane before the postscript, had been something that I understood, reading it, was meant for me to carry rather than to deliver. A mother's private grief that had nowhere left to go. She said she loved you, I said. Completely, without qualification, even knowing everything. I paused. That's what she said. Diane didn't respond for several seconds. When she did, her voice was very small. Okay, she said. Okay. We stayed on the line for another minute without either of us speaking, which was not uncomfortable. Then she said goodbye and I said goodbye, and I sat on the porch for a long time after, with the coffee going cold in my hand. I want to be honest about what I felt after that call, because I think the honest version is more useful than the clean version. I did not feel resolved. I did not feel the particular warmth that comes from reconciliation in the way movies present reconciliation, the swelling, the relief, the sense that the broken thing has been mended. What I felt was something more complicated and less comfortable than that. Grief for what my daughter had become and might not fully come back from. Anger that had quieted but not disappeared. And underneath both of those, something stubborn and inconvenient that I could only call love, because it was still there regardless of what I did with it, the way load-bearing elements stay in place even when the structure around them has changed completely. I was not going to sacrifice myself on the altar of that love. Not again. Not the way I had in those first days after Margaret died, when I had trusted blindly and signed things I didn't understand and paid the full cost of my own willingness to believe the best about someone who had stopped deserving it. But I was also not going to pretend the love wasn't there. That seemed like its own kind of dishonesty. What I understood, sitting on that porch on that morning, was that you could love someone and still hold a boundary they had to earn their way back across. That those two things were not in contradiction. That forgiveness, if it came, would be something I gave myself, not a restoration of trust that hadn't been rebuilt yet. Real trust is not given because someone apologizes for taking it. Real trust is rebuilt the way everything worth having is built, slowly, with demonstrated work, over time. I was 71 years old and I had just learned this. That is either a tragedy or a testament to how long it can take to understand the things that matter. I have decided it is the latter because the alternative is too depressing to sit with. The formal legal resolution of Carson's case took 8 months from the date of arrest. He pled guilty on 2 of the major counts after the evidence package made a full trial inadvisable for his defense, accepting a negotiated sentence that included significant prison time and mandatory restitution to the investors who had lost money in his prior schemes. The restitution figure was large enough that it would take years to satisfy. The attorney who negotiated it told the financial press that his client accepted responsibility for his actions, which is the kind of sentence that lawyers write, and which means precisely nothing about whether the person actually does. The house was sold by the court as part of asset liquidation. I did not attend the sale. I had driven by it once in the early weeks, not for any particular reason, just to see it from the street. It looked the same from outside. It looked like a house where a family had lived. I sat in front of it for about 5 minutes and then drove away, and I have not been back since. The money recovered through the challenged wire transfers and the legal process went into a separate account that Patricia helped me structure sensibly, the kind of boring conservative financial arrangement that Margaret would have approved of and that I had no particular opinions about beyond wanting it managed by someone competent and not exciting. I was not interested in exciting anymore. I was interested in stable. Stable, at this point in my life, was its own form of luxury. The water rights became the foundation of a different kind of conversation. 3 months after the Wells Capital project collapsed, Patricia began fielding approaches from 2 separate development groups who were aware of the aquifer's significance and interested in negotiating legitimate water rights agreements. These were not Carson-style conversations. They were straightforward commercial negotiations, conducted with full legal representation on both sides, with documentation that meant what it said. Desmond handled the water rights portion. Patricia handled everything else. I will not pretend I was fully present in all of those conversations. I attended the important ones, asked the questions that mattered, deferred to Patricia and Desmond on the technical points where their expertise exceeded mine. What I understood clearly, and what I held on to through all of it, was that those rights represented something Margaret had protected for me. I was not going to give them away cheaply or quickly or without understanding what I was agreeing to. I was going to be the man she had left them to. We settled on an agreement with one of the development groups, a long-term water rights easement with terms that protected the aquifer's long-term viability and provided annual payments that were, Patricia said with the closest thing to enthusiasm she showed about financial matters, genuinely significant. Not generational wealth in the headline sense, but permanent, documented, defensible income from a piece of land that had looked, to everyone who underestimated it, like nothing. The day the agreement was signed, I drove out to the barn in the late afternoon and opened the vault and went down the stairs and stood among the cars. The Shelby Cobra in its electric blue, the Ferrari with its long nose and its history, the Gullwing with its doors that opened upward like something that wanted to take flight. Margaret had touched every one of these. She had made decisions about them over years, paid attention to them, maintained them with the same methodical care she had brought to everything she believed was worth keeping. I sat on the stairs at the bottom of the vault for a long time. "Okay," I said, to the cars, to the room, to whoever or whatever was still present in the choices this space represented. "Okay, I think we're going to be all right. I'm living on the farm now, full-time. This is not a temporary arrangement. I have rebuilt the farmhouse into something genuinely livable. Not grand, not the 30-year house with the good neighborhood and the finished basement and the kitchen Margaret had renovated twice because the first renovation wasn't quite right. This is a simpler house. Clean lines, good materials, a porch that faces west so you get the sunsets, which out here are a specific kind of extravagant that seems almost unnecessary given everything else the desert provides. I have a vegetable garden that is partially successful, which means some things grow and some things don't, and I am learning the difference by being wrong about it and trying again. Ruth Haddad comes out for dinner occasionally. She lives 3 hours away and she is not sentimental about driving, and she will argue about anything from wine to federal regulatory policy with a sharp precision that I find genuinely entertaining. She was Margaret's friend before she was involved in any of this, and she carries Margaret in the way people carry friends they have lost, with the particular combination of grief and gratitude that is different from every other kind. Patricia remains my attorney. She has become, without either of us making a formal announcement of the fact, something closer to a friend, the kind of professional relationship that occasionally has dinner attached to it when the business portion is done. She is more guarded than Ruth and funnier than she lets on, and she takes her work seriously enough to have given my wife 2 years of careful preparation for the sake of a client she genuinely respected. Gerald sold the Shelby Cobra and the Plymouth Cuda through a private collector network at prices that made the initial appraisal look conservative. The remaining 4 cars are still in the vault, where I am in no hurry to put them anywhere else. I visit them sometimes, in the evenings, when the desert is cooling down and the light through the barn slats goes gold. I don't need to explain why. Some things don't require explanation. Diane and I have spoken 11 times since the phone call on the porch. The conversations are careful and not always comfortable, and that is the right pace for where we are. She has a job now, bookkeeping, which is either ironic or fitting, and I have decided to call it fitting because it connects her to her mother in a way I'd rather read as meaningful. She has made, as far as I can tell, the series of smaller decisions that add up to a life being rebuilt. I am watching. I am not rushing. The door is not closed, but I am the one who decides when it opens further, and I am in no hurry. She asked me in the 9th conversation whether I ever thought about what things would have been like if I had never found the vault, if I had been the man they believed me to be, depleted, isolated, too broken by grief, and too trusting by nature to fight back. I thought about it honestly. I would have lost everything, I said. The property, whatever money I had left, probably my health eventually, because that's what happens to people who lose their footing at my age and have nobody to catch them. I paused. And your mother would have known that somewhere, whatever version of knowing is available to someone who isn't here anymore, and that would have been its own kind of injustice. Diane was quiet on the line. But here's the thing, I said. She made sure that didn't happen. Not because she was trying to win something, not because she wanted to punish anyone. She did it because she loved me enough to spend 2 years that she needed for herself on building something that would protect me after she was gone. I paused. That's what love actually looks like, Diane. It looks like work. It looks like sacrifice. It looks like someone choosing you, consistently, even when it costs them. I didn't say the rest of what I was thinking, which was, and it does not look like what you did. Not because I wanted to wound her, but because she already knew it and saying it again would not teach her anything new. So I'm going to say it to you instead. I have spent 7 decades on this earth. I have built structures that are still standing. I have loved one person completely for 41 years. I have made mistakes I can see clearly in retrospect, and mistakes I still can't fully account for. And what I have come to understand on the far side of the worst year of my life is this. The people who love you, genuinely, without agenda, they show you in ways that don't require you to interpret them. They show up when it is inconvenient. They protect you when you are not looking. They tell you hard truths even when the timing is terrible, because telling you something easy that harms you is not love. It is performance. It is management. It is the currency used by people who want what you have rather than who you are. Learn to tell the difference before you need to. And the other thing, the harder thing, the one I resisted for longer than I should have, you are allowed to protect yourself. You're allowed to draw a line around what is yours, your assets, your dignity, your grief, your time, and say this is not available for the taking, not by a son-in-law with fraudulent paperwork, not by a daughter with a practiced smile, not by anyone who has confused your generosity for an absence of limits. Older people are taught, sometimes, that their job is to give, to smooth things over, to absorb the costs of other people's choices without complaint, because complaint would be selfish and dignity would be inconvenient. I believed that for too long. I signed documents I didn't understand because I trusted people who had not earned that trust, and I paid the price of it in a motel room with $400 and a broken heart. Margaret knew better. Margaret had always known better. She just had to find a way to teach me from the grave, which is both the most heartbreaking and the most Margaret thing she ever did. The greatest thing she left me was not the cars, or the water rights, or the forensic files, or the attorney's retainer. Those were extraordinary gifts, and I do not minimize them. But the greatest thing was the letter. 4 pages in her handwriting, telling me the truth she hadn't been able to say while she was alive, laying it out without softening it, and ending with a single instruction: don't let them win. I didn't. I am standing on the porch of a farmhouse in the desert on a Tuesday evening, watching the sun go down over 240 acres of land that looked like nothing and turned out to hold everything. The light is doing the thing it does out here, that specific extravagance, all orange and purple, and the particular deep blue that comes in at the edges. The hawk is back, or a different hawk, working the last of the warm air. I have a coffee in my hand. It has gone slightly cold, the way coffee does when you get absorbed in something else. Margaret would have noticed and told me to go make a fresh cup. I think about her every day. I will think about her every day for the rest of my life. That is not sadness exactly, though it contains sadness. It is the specific weight of having loved someone correctly for long enough that losing them does not erase them. She is in the cars. She is in the letter. She is in the hawk and the water beneath the ground and the firm posture of Patricia Okafor and the way Ruth argues about regulatory policy over dinner. She is in every decision I have made correctly since I drove out of that motel parking lot at 4:30 in the morning. She told me not to let them win. I didn't. And finally, after 71 years of being a man who built things for other people to live in, I am building something for myself. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is, it turns out, everything.